Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm David Reed. The Catholic Church is at a crossroads. Pope Benedict XVI surprised just about everybody this week by announcing his resignation. The leader of the world's 1 billion Catholics held his final public mass yesterday, and at the end of this month, he will become the first pope to resign in nearly 600 years. Joining us today to explain what's ahead for the Catholic Church are two of the world's top religion reporters, including a Vatican correspondent who's written the biography of Pope Benedict. In our second segment, we'll delve into the growing debate over drone strikes and their extensive use by the Obama administration, and the rationale for secretly using the remote-controlled weapon to kill U.S. citizens deemed to be terrorists. But first, World Watch. Our international news summary begins with the so-called leader of the free world. More than 33 million people watched President Barack Obama deliver the annual State of the Union address. Domestic policy dominated the speech, but the president did stress the need to combat global climate change. He challenged Congress to pursue a market-based strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's a cap-and-trade system that is already well established in Europe. And Obama called for a free trade agreement between the United States and the European Union. And he chastised North Korea for carrying out an underground nuclear test this week, while pledging to work with Russia to reduce its nuclear weapons arsenal. On that same topic, a new round of talks between Iran and the UN nuclear watchdog in Iran's capital concluded today. Tehran Times quotes a foreign ministry spokesman as saying his country was ready to sign a deal. But a UN representative said they again failed to resolve the outstanding issues regarding Iran's nuclear program. Obama also announced plans to withdraw 34,000 troops from Afghanistan, and he declared that by the end of next year, the war will be over. The next day, the governor of Kunar province said that a NATO-led airstrike killed 3 Taliban commanders and at least 10 civilians. Amid continuing political and economic turmoil in Egypt, protesters threw Molotov cocktails at the presidential palace and caused fire damage. Security forces used tear gas bombs to disperse the crowd. And while the clashes diminished at midweek, a major protest march is taking place Friday. In Syria, rebels seized the nation's largest hydroelectric dam. This enabled them to control a large part of the electric and water supply of the country's north and east. In Bulgaria, the interior minister blamed Lebanon's militant group Hezbollah for a bus attack on a Bulgarian city resort last July. The bombing killed at least 5 Israeli tourists in the bus as well as a Bulgarian driver. In health news, Nepalese officials have had to kill more than 14,000 chickens in order to try to stop H5N1, the bird flu, from spreading. Russia has banned all U.S. meat imports due to a chemical found within American meat. The FDA says small amounts have no risk to human health, but the EU, China, and Russia have not approved it, citing health effects to the animals. Finally, the horse meat scare is intensifying in Europe. A frozen food company is under investigation in Britain, Ireland, Poland, and France for reportedly using horse meat in some of their products that has been sold as beef. A British parliamentary report this week said the discoveries so far are likely to be, quote, the tip of the iceberg. And most recently, Sweden's food safety authorities say they'll start doing DNA tests on some supermarket frozen meals because traces of horse meat was found in the products. So that's it for World Watch. And now onto a broader examination of the biggest news of the week, the Pope's surprise resignation. Alessandro Speciale is the Vatican correspondent for Religion News Service. He's a Roman by birth and has often appeared on the world's top broadcasting networks as an expert on Vatican affairs. David Gibson is an award-winning religion journalist, author, filmmaker, and a convert to Catholicism. Gibson also writes for Religion News Service. Alessandro, you're at Vatican City and you've been watching these historic events unfold firsthand. How emotional was the scene at the Vatican when the Pope gave his final Mass?
Well, the first impression was utter shock and surprise. People, except, I guess, the people which were in the very close Vatican papal circle, didn't see this coming. And so when the news was one was, did I hear it right? Also because it was speaking in Latin, so
Yeah.
not many of the cardinals are actually that fluent in Latin to be sure that they got it right when they first heard it. And the same was for us. In fact, there was a couple of colleagues who were actually listening on into this fairly minor speech that nobody was expecting any surprise at that moment. And it took them a few minutes to actually realize what they had heard and looking for confirmation to such an extraordinary news.
Right. And David, your biography, The Rules of Benedict, captures the dramatic moments in St. Peter's Square when then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger of Germany was announced as the next pope. And now he's become the first pope since Celestine V in 1294 to abdicate. And were there any signs that this was coming? I know that there was talk in the Italian press that he may be retiring off and on, correct?
Yes, I mean this was a shock because it hasn't happened in 600 years, and no pope has voluntarily resigned in over 700 years, as you say. That was Celestine V back in, I think, 1294 or so. But it shouldn't have been a surprise. I mean, Joseph Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger, his name before he was elected Benedict XVI, had told an interviewer a couple of years ago, he said, if any pope or if I myself don't feel psychologically or physically up to the job, it's your duty to resign. And there had been several signs, apart from his flagging energy and the difficulties he was facing, that he was really considering this move. Back in 2009, he visited the tomb of Pope Celestine, and the Pope wears a special kind of shawl, kind of called a pallium. He placed his own pallium shawl on the tomb of Celestine V. If that hadn't been a signal that he was contemplating
Right.
that, I don't know what was. So really, I think it was, people expected, ironically, this most traditional of popes, and he's very orthodox, would be the one to do the most untraditional of moves, a kind of Nixon to China move, really, for the papacy.
Right. And now the Vatican spokesman said that the conclave to choose the next pope would begin in mid-March, and a new leader of the church is expected to be in place by Easter, March 31st. Alessandro, could you give us a brief description of this strange process of picking a new pope?
Well, yes, it's a ritual that has been accumulating in centuries and is now pretty much fixed. And the cardinals gather in Rome 15 to 20 days after, well, usually a pope's death, but in this case a pope's resignation. And there is a mass in St. Peter's, celebrated by a senior cardinal that lays out the themes for reflection for the cardinals. And then this group of about 117 to be precise, elderly men get locked up in a now quite luxurious sort of hotel inside the Vatican and gather twice every day in the Sistine Chapel under Michelangelo's frescoes, and they vote using voting cards inscribed in Latin. And they need to receive a two-thirds majority. And the strange thing is that there is no overt campaigning, even if, of course, a campaigning of sorts and meetings and discussions happen all the time because they have to choose. But a person who is seen as vying openly for the job, usually this is considered a big handicap and probably is just ruining his chances.
Well, that's interesting. So following up on that, I'm going to ask each of you to go out on a limb here. Your educated guess, who will be the next pope? First, Alessandro.
Well, I seriously, honestly wouldn't know who will be pope. And there are a couple of strong contenders. Probably the top contender right now seems to be a Canadian cardinal, which has a lot of cure experience. Is very orthodox, as Ratzinger was, but he has also an experience that spent many years in Latin America as a missionary, so he speaks fluent Spanish, and this is the language spoken by there's a great majority of Catholics in the world, and this is Latin America where most of Catholics live, and is Cardinal Vele. But I honestly don't know. It is quite an open conclave, and Benedict's decision was unexpected and probably upset all the calculations, and cardinals are kind of unprepared for this. My personal choice, I would very much like the Manila's cardinal, a Filipino by the name of Luis Antonio Tagle, who is a warm, very simple, very touching, but at the same time very effective person. And I think he would make a great pope, but this is just a personal. He's kind of young at 56, so probably he doesn't have so much of a chance.
Right. And David, what are your thoughts?
I think anyone who guesses is a fool. So
tell me who the front runner is, maybe.
Even though I'm a journalist, which is you're paid to be foolish. I guess the best thing to do is to direct people to the Irish online betting site paddypower.com, where they've got Archbishop Cardinal Scola of Milan, an Italian, at the 11-4 odds. So he's the front runner. But Cardinal Turkson, the African, is kind of second ranking. He's getting a lot of mentions. He works at the Vatican, but he's an African and from Ghana, and would be a remarkable choice. And as Alessandro said, Cardinal Ouellet, a Canadian, is getting a lot of buzz. I think, it really is such an open conclave, and it's so hard. I mean, you don't have primaries. This isn't like a normal election like in the United States. You don't have primaries. You don't have nominating conventions. You don't have all of this kind of run-up and campaigning. And so there's no kind of even sorting out. I mean, the Catholic Church says it's the Holy Spirit who guides the cardinals, and they also say that the Holy Spirit enjoys its little jokes. So, it's you can never really tell what's going to happen. Really, the big choice, I think, that's coming up here, and the one that people have to look at, and which makes it so hard, is it's a choice between whether the cardinals are going to stick with a European and an Italian, perhaps giving the papacy back to the Italians, or whether they're going to go outside, again, to Cardinal Tagle, as Alessandro said, from the Philippines, go to Asia, Africa, Latin America, where the bulk of Catholics live. That's the big choice.
And that's where the growth, right, is in the Catholic Church.
Exactly. I mean, if you're a marketing consultant, you're going to say, look, your growth is there, but the College of Cardinals is still predominantly European, Italian, North American.
Right. And Alessandro, let me ask you this now. This is really unusual because Benedict, the current Pope, might have an impact on this because he named most of these cardinals, right?
Yeah, he named almost 70 of the cardinals who will get a vote in the conclave.
Right. And so do you, I guess maybe David, you could answer where you think he would be leaning, who you think he backs?
Cardinal Ratzinger himself?
Yes.
It's hard to say. There are a number of cardinals there. Cardinal Scola of Milan, as I mentioned, but also Cardinal Schönborn from Austria, who would be of the school of Cardinal Ratzinger. Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, was a theologian and a scholar, and he had a real kind of, a number of disciples almost in terms of his views on theology, and a number of them have been appointed to the College of Cardinals. But it's hard to say. He also knows that sometimes the papacy needs a change. You need a change just in terms of demographics, who you're going to pick.
And the church is going through a struggle. How big of an impact will this have? As we said, they're at a crossroads. How big a deal is this?
It's a huge deal. I think it's very important. I think that the church project a sense that it hears the cries of its people, both in terms of some sort of accountability on sex abuse, the role of women, things like that. Look, whoever comes out on that balcony in March as the new pope is not going to suddenly change the church teaching on contraception, on gay marriage, that kind of thing. But he can have a different emphasis. He can promote greater openness and transparency on sex abuse, but you have to realize those are also concerns that are very North American concerns. The American church is 6% of the overall 1.1 billion Catholics. The great concerns for the church in the world are social justice, poverty, all of these kinds of things, the growing gap between the rich and the poor.
Right.
These are things that a pope from the southern hemisphere could really address very powerfully, and that the church, I think, everywhere would look for.
Okay, now we'll have to move on to our next segment. David, Alessandro, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion, a real insider's view of of a complex religion. And before we begin our segment on the military's use of drone aircraft, I want to remind everyone that you can view or listen to this program anytime by downloading our podcasts at globaljournalist.org. You also can find interesting articles, photos, and interviews related to our program on our website. So please send us questions or comments via globaljournalist@kbia.org or our Facebook page. You could also follow us on Twitter at globaljorn. On a previous program, we talked with peace activist Judith Bello about America's use of drone strikes and her visit to an area of Pakistan near the target zone. Bill Roggio, a former Army soldier and the editor of the Long War Journal, was unable to be with us on the program that day, but he's with us now to provide a more favorable perspective on the practice of drone strikes. The Long War Journal website provides original reporting and analysis of what Roggio calls the global war on terror. Coverage includes strategic and operational issues relating to the conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and Pakistan, along with al-Qaeda's operations, tactics, and strategy. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks. It's a pleasure.
Let's start with a basic question, but often the most complicated. Why? Why has the American commander-in-chief used drone attacks so extensively, including more than 300 strikes in Pakistan?
The answer to that is because al-Qaeda continues to this day, 11 years plus after the attacks on 9/11, to remain a threat, and it continues to have training camps, and it continues to recruit and indoctrinate people, particularly in Pakistan, although it's happening in Yemen and other parts of the world as well.
Mm-hmm.
That is where a bit of al-Qaeda's core is located, although it's not located just in the area where we're conducting the drone strikes. And we're attempting to disrupt the next terrorist attack on the United States. So that is essentially that's the basic reason for doing this.
And how effective have they been?
Well, there hasn't been an attack on the United States. There's been two attacks that almost went through, despite the uptick in drone strikes. Then one of them emanated from Yemen over Detroit in 2009. If the bomber had gotten the detonator right, we'd had a plane explode over over Detroit. And then the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan attempted to conduct an attack in Times Square in May of 2010, and again another detonator issue. So despite the uptick in drone program, al-Qaeda still has a coherent network, right, and its allies and affiliates and al-Qaeda stuff are still plotting to attack the U.S. But I would say it's killed several senior leaders and operatives for the group,
right,
and it's disrupted their operations. It's forced them to focus on preservation as opposed to being able to openly plot attacks against the U.S. and allies. But it's not going to actually defeat the organization, and that's the way the Obama administration has sold this program. They've substituted a tactic, the drone strikes, for killing individuals, for the strategy of for a comprehensive strategy to defeat al-Qaeda.
And let's go back to Yemen and the Obama administration. A recent attack in Yemen that killed two more citizens from the United States has caused some outrage and prompted the government to release a document defending the use of drones to kill people suspected of terrorism and or terrorist activity, including American citizens like Anwar al-Awlaki. Does a secret document that was first obtained by NBC News provide a legal basis for such extrajudicial killings, in your opinion?
It's a really good question, and I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not very comfortable commenting on it. I operate on a common sense, and either we're at war with al-Qaeda or we're not. My view is that we are. Their attack on the United States and their open declarations of war, to me, gives the justification to do so. And if you're an American citizen fighting for al-Qaeda, or a non-American, to me, you are fair game. Look, in World War II, I don't think we, kvetched over whether we're going to kill Americans who are fighting for the Nazis or fighting for Italy or other countries. I don't think we should be doing the same here. Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan, who were killed in that strike, were clearly members of al-Qaeda. They ran al-Qaeda propaganda. Awlaki was involved in recruiting and in operations. You just look at what they did publicly, and I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever. People wanted a trial. People want some type of legal justification. To me, it's clear as day that Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan are enemies of the United States. If you view this as you're in a war, then it's simple. If you want to deal with this like you're conducting a law enforcement operation, then of course you would be concerned for a legal justification.
Right. Well, let's talk a bit about that. How this affects strategy. But first, one of the criticisms of the drone strikes is that they have killed a large number of civilians, the unintended casualties. How much do we know about that?
Well, the answer is we really don't. Myself, the New America Foundation, and Bureau for Investigative Journalism all attempt to try and quantify that number. And so the number of civilians killed could be anywhere from 1 to 800 out of about 3,000 plus people killed. The reality is any type of war, it's impossible to have zero civilian casualties. I think the drone campaign makes the best effort to do so, but it is by no means perfect at this. The administration has claimed in the past that there's been 0 deaths or only 5 to 10, and that's absolutely ludicrous. It's not the case. Civilians have indeed been killed, but often in some cases, some of these civilians are, say, the wives or children of terrorist leaders who are being targeted. I see this quite often, and this is what happens when you're fighting a war against a group that is operating within the civilian population.
Now, what's your rough count? I think it's in hundreds. Is that right?
My numbers come around somewhere in Pakistan. That is somewhere around 100 or so, 100 plus. I wouldn't be shocked if that number was double or tripled. The new the Bureau for Investigative Journalism comes around. They're just to show how little they have an understanding of it as much as I do. Their estimate ranges from 4 to 800. So their margin of error is 100%. So we really don't know. We're all trying to gather an understanding. I wouldn't be shocked if my number is too low or their number is too high. It wouldn't surprise me in the least. The fact is the way that this campaign is being conducted, civilians are going to be killed. I do believe the program is doing everything it can to limit those casualties, but it's impossible to get to a number of zero.
Right. But there has been some criticism, even from former members of Obama's counterterrorism group and retired General Stanley McChrystal, who are essentially saying that we're making more enemies then we're killing enemies by doing this.
Well, look, it's never a zero-sum game. The drones can't be all good or have all positive effects or all negative effects. I think General McChrystal's criticism was more that they're being overused, and I concur with him. They are. We should be using these sparingly. This is a problem. So the administration has basically sold the drones. They've come up with a kill strategy. We're going to kill our way to defeating al-Qaeda, but they're not addressing the core issues of why al-Qaeda and allied groups are succeeding and thriving and continuing to thrive 11 years after going to war with them. There are cases where drones, where it causes bad sentiment amongst the population, but you also see reports where people encourage them, where Pakistanis will go to reporters when their Pakistani handlers aren't there, and will say, more of these are killing the people that are oppressing them. So, yeah, you're going to get both sides of it, and again, I think this is why they should be used more sparingly, though. I think it creates a bigger perception problem in the Muslim world as well, that the U.S. is striking, is killing Muslims indiscriminately. I mean, that's how it's portrayed. Right. And unfortunately, whether that's true or not, that's the narrative that seems to stick. And the Pakistani government doesn't help out because while they support some of the drone strikes on on one hand, they will openly denounce them even at the UN. So they're feeding Al-Qaeda's propaganda.
Now, the author of a recent Council on Foreign Relations report argues that the United States should end the so-called signature strikes, which target unidentified militants based on their behavior patterns and personal networks. Micah Zenko, the author, also asserts that the U.S. should limit targeted killings to a limited number of specific terrorists with transnational ambitions, and he called on Congress to improve its oversight of drone strikes and to continue restrictions on armed drone sales. And finally, he recommends that the United States work internationally to establish rules and norms governing the use of drones. So I sense there are a couple of points that you agree on with Zenko. What are your points, just briefly, what are your points of agreement and disagreement there?
Well, I think a main point of disagreement, and I think he's falling into this trap, this transnational threat. Al-Qaeda doesn't have, divisions within their group where they say, you are specifically devoted to attacking the West, and you guys over here, you're just devoted to conducting attacks here locally. Al-Qaeda doesn't really operate that way. So it's if you want to just sort of save Al-Qaeda's local group or the jihadist local group, it does. That's not going to solve the problem, because the same camps that are training people to fight in Afghanistan and Pakistan or Uzbekistan or in Central Asia or in Western China are the same camps that are churning out terrorists to conduct attacks. The same guy who's building local IEDs for Afghanistan or Pakistan is probably the same guy who is imparting knowledge to build bombs for operatives overseas.
Right. Well,
so it's really the administration wants to to define the threat of Al-Qaeda as being limited to just those who want to conduct attacks on the homeland. Well, if you use that metric, Al-Qaeda wasn't a threat in the United States from 1993 to 2001, the first World Trade Center bombing. There was no attacks between the first and second World Trade Center bombings in the United States. So was Al-Qaeda defeated? Did they not have ambitions to attack in the United States? We know the answer is no. And they still waged their jihad locally in multiple theaters. They worked with the Afghan Taliban to fight the Northern Alliance, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to recount, a decade of history there, but the administration is viewing it. It's not going to be a threat to the United States until it's a threat to the United States, and that's very short-sighted.
Okay, Bill, I think we're going to have to leave it there, and I really appreciate you talking with us today. And I think this is a topic that will be ongoing. It'll be interesting to watch how it develops.
Thanks. It's a pleasure.
We've come to the end of this week's edition of Global Journalist. Our program is produced by the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our program is directed by Travis McMillan, audio by Pat Akers, Raymond Tungakar is our executive producer, Donovan Ferguson and Sravani Pear were our lead producers. Please join us again next week for another Global Journalist. I'm David Reed.